there are a couple of rules we've already sort of established, and they'll get you some of the ways there, but there's also a bit of an art to it as well. So let me just share screen. Let me show you some basic ideas. First thing you want to say is there's lots of different ways of getting color sort of choices, and complementaries I think is the model that I'd be wanting to use here. So you really would choose. Most branding will have at least one, main color, and in this one we're dealing with, there's only really blues and a couple of variations of blues. Let's just ignore the gray for a second. But some branding will have two colors, in which case this complementary may or may not work depending on how well they've chosen their colors. But the idea is with a complementary color palette, you should have a reasonably high contrast between the two main colors, and that's kind of what we really want to sort of strive for in that respect, because there'll be times where we're going to be blending those colors and they need to sit well together, as well as next to the more neutral colors that we've got in our color palette. So if you have a look at this, so hopefully this is how it's been sort of implemented. I presume it has been. So if you look below that dashed line, these are all our colors that are common for all the for all the sites. So above, we've got the opportunity to choose six choices as far as colors, and it's really just two main colors and a light and a dark version of those two colors. And it's really important to get this light enough, and you can sort of see on the current site, where are we? On this site here. So this is the light blue here. It's probably a little bit too dark for my likings. I think one of the things you'd want to sort of do on this page was take this lighter blue right back. So I'm presuming this is the light blue, and we've also got, hang on a second, let me just move this around a bit. We've got the two blues here, and we've got a couple of variations of looks like grey and yellow as part of the primaries. So first thing I would do is make sure when you start off, the first thing you need to do is pick these two colors, okay? The mids for the primary and secondary, and that should really inform a whole bunch of stuff from there. How you get to these two colors on either side of that, we'll get to that in a second. But these two colors here are really important to get them right. And so in our example, we've got, it looks like we've basically got this logo, right? That's kind of looks like where things are derived from, and there's all sorts of stuff going on here. As far as we've got a gradient of blues here, slightly greenish tint to the colors here, and then we've also got a more vibrant sort of blue here as well. Looks like it's some sort of Jewish kind of emblem, so that makes sense that would be the blue color there. So that's totally fine. I would never really waste a primary or secondary color on a neutral color, and that's kind of looks like what some of the colors that it looks like have been done here. Like this color here, for example, this is a gray color, and it looks like, and the banner subtitle here, background, it looks like that's a gray that we've chosen as one of the primary colors. So I think that's probably a bit of a mistake, even though the branding is great, I get that, but I think the branding itself potentially will be able to carry that fine just by choosing the blue and making it the primary, and maybe even because blue is largely kind of dark, I'd even be more inclined to make that your secondary color and then pick your primary. Now you guys have chosen yellow, which I think is a totally good choice as far as picking a color that's going to complement blue. And so as you saw back here on the Adobe color wheel, like it's not far off. Like yellows and blues will complement each other well. It's just really a matter of then dialing in and getting the right yellow and the right blues, and that's where it sort of gets a little bit subjective. So there's a couple of things that I would do, particularly when I'm playing around with these colors. And let me just introduce you to sort of how I choose my colors. So if you have a look at here in Photoshop, this is called the hue, saturation, and brightness model. There's lots of different ways of models for colors. And this hue, saturation, brightness model is really handy because it allows you to to sort of deviate from a common sort of theme very easily. So for example, if we have, this is our primary blue, we can do a couple of things. The hue is really important. The hue is essentially the color, and then the saturation and the brightness is pretty much just how you deviate tonally around that one sort of color sort of palette. And so more traditional colors would just stick for all sort of three. You'd stick to the same hue, and you play around with the saturation and the brightness. So let's have a look. So if we play the saturation right up, you'll see how that becomes a much more vibrant color. And then if we play around with brightness as well, it's hugely bright. So we can play around all in this whole square here. You can see on the left hand side is all playing within the 201 sort of hue range, if that makes sense. So you can play around with that and get a very light sort of blue for your secondary light, and then you probably come all the way down here for a very dark sort of blue as well. And those colors will play nicely with each other. You sort of see if you go up and down, it can desaturate very quickly and gets very sort of grey. So often when you want to move around here, you kind of want to move it 45 degrees, kind of, if that makes sense. Like if you start here, sort of want to go down that way and sort of head up that way. And it's not, you can get mathematical about it, and often I would basically say, look, I would deviate either way a particular direction in my hue and brightness and get those three colors. But you don't really need to do that. You can just pick your primary or your secondary color, and then within here, just pick and choose some really nice sort of dark. And don't be afraid to make the dark quite dark and the light to make it quite light. So that's my sort of first sort of tip there. Often what will look good though, and this is where it gets a bit more advanced, is that actually screwing around with the hue a little bit can kind of look really good. You often find on, like when you're playing around with reds, for example, often you'll see in sort of more modern sort of design, you'll see red sitting very closely to like a burnt orange and also to a sort of a violety sort of color as well. And what they've really done here is if you choose red, for example, so your hue's bang on 0 at red, to get some nice colors either side of that, you can actually go a little bit above and a little bit sort of below, and you can play around with screwing around with the hues a little bit, not too far. So you probably wouldn't want to move the hue any more than 20 degrees from the original point, and that can get you some nice sort of color variation as well. It have a little bit more of a modern feel. A good example of that would be like if I'm choosing yellows, for example, and I want a really sort of really bulk standard kind of yellow, like more of a sort of a burnt, hang on, I need some more, a burnt, sun-filled sort of yellow, like here, around here, with a little bit, let's use this as an example. A nice, really bright sort of yellow. Often what will work well next to that is actually if I shift the hue a little bit to a green and go really vibrant yellow, that can sit really well at this is where the subjectivity comes in, a really bright modern yellow next to a real traditional sort of goldy sort of yellow. So that's an example of screwing around with the hue a little bit and having those variations sort of that way. So that's, I mean, I don't know how helpful that was, but from my point of view, your process really is getting these two colors right. First, they need to sit well together. So in our example, I think we make blue our secondary, and we will choose that nice sort of, in this take, I would sort of choose, you've got a gradient here. So I'd color pick something in the middle there. And I think that's that's fine. So I'd make that my secondary mid, and then playing around with that, I would go up nice and high and get a very light sort of blue of the same hue, and then grab that. And I'd also come down here and grab a very dark blue. And then I wouldn't screw around with hues in this example. I think they're probably a little bit more traditional and probably it's not going to work well. So I think that's a reasonably safe sort of place. Grab those colors, chuck them in, see how they look. It'll take a couple, a bit of toing and froing before you sort of get it right. But that's largely what I would do there. And then for your primary, I think you've chosen yellow. That's probably the right call. I would pick, uh, I would pick a very, uh, you could pick a very goldeny sort of yellow, but I think you've almost got more of a lemony sort of color. I think that could be right. So playing around with that, you may want to, play around the hue variation a little bit as you go to the dark and to the light. So you got a slightly more tennis ball color yellow at the bright end, and a little bit more of a golden sunset sort of yellow at the darker end. That's just really trial and error on that front, and so there's no real sort of rules there. The main rule is pick a complementary color, as far as what we sort of dealt with at the beginning. So make sure that those colors are kind of working, and if you're dictated to where that's not going to be the case, because they've already got two colors in their branding, then you just got to make the best of it, really. Hopefully, you can still make that work. In my example that I used for our archetype one, these colours aren't necessarily, they're not necessarily complementary. They're both sort of, they've both got sort of violety sort of tinges to it, but you can sort of see at a hue level, one's tending towards red and one's tending towards sort of more of a blue. So it doesn't always have to be complementary, but these two main color choices are really important. And then if nothing else, you just then get to Photoshop or whatever, stick to the same hue, go 45 degrees up nice and high, get your light, go 45 degrees down, get a reasonable dark. The trick here with primary, you don't need that much variation. As you can see here, your variation on the primary is a lot less, is a lot more subtle than it is on the secondary. Secondary is where you're going to have contrast issues, and so for your secondary color, it's more your dark. Whatever is the dark of the two colors you choose is your secondary color, and so you want to go really dark for your secondary dark and quite light for your secondary light. You don't have to spread around quite so much here with your primaries, and that should give you a reasonably good spread. And then ideally, these rules down here are important because this is all about readability. So you'll see here, I'm not sure if you use this, but if we go to this here, this is a great contrast checker. And so you'll type in whatever you end up with your colors. So let's say, primary, neutral, light, light, and primary mid. You get those two colors in hexadecimal. You put them in here. And what you want to ensure that this contrast ratio is more than 4.5 every time. So, for example, just to give you an example how this works, the most contrast you can ever have is 21:1. So that's black on white. That's your highest contrast possible. And obviously, if you have black on black, the contrast ratio goes down to 1:1. Impossible to read. And so we want to at least adhere to 4.5:1, which is an accessibility requirement for you guys to make sure that visually impaired people can read, but it's also just good straight up design to sort of make sure that happens. Sometimes you'll get really close and you're really happy with the colors and it doesn't quite make. It's up to you guys. You're not really bound by, but be guided by this. But if it gets to the point where you really like the colors and it's like a 4.3, or that's fine. Don't worry too much about it. From a legislation point of view, my understanding is people can complain about sites, and if it goes on record, no one probably ever does, but if it goes on record and the government would ever find out about it, and it's in this highly unlikely scenario, then they may push on you to make sure it does adhere to WCAG standards, and if you don't, after you've been warned, potentially there's recourse. But I think the reality is I've never, ever, ever, ever heard that happening. But these Web Consortium accessibility guidelines, WCAG, are good things to adhere to. And Anthony, know all about this. And they will help guide how these variations of colours play with each other. So there's a lot of talking there. I'm not sure if any of that was useful. Happy to take questions.
I'll ask a question first.
Sure.
When we get and sorry if you've already answered this, when we get the logo, how do we quickly identify primary and secondary?
Yep. Well, in the example we've got here, let's use this as your classic example. So first thing, I would never waste, like I said before, unless you really have to, and you can do it, but I probably wouldn't waste a primary or secondary with a neutral color.
Okay.
So that would be my first sort of thing. So I would say we've got a neutral palette throughout the site anyway that sort of would potentially hit that. You could do it for sure, but a monochromatic site can look very samey and nothing will pop. And a lot of the design that we've come up with is that we want a whole bunch of stuff to pop. So it's really about the interplay between primary and secondary. And if your primary is grey, it's just going to look flat. So I would avoid that first of all. You can sort of see here in this example, there's two tops of blue here. We've obviously got a continuous gradient here, but it's largely the same hue. And we've got a slightly different hue. So this is probably about 205 hue here. Yep. So, and then like if we play around with this, it's only going to be a little bit different. It'll be about 201, 200. And you'll see that's actually, this is more of a greeny tinge than this. To me, this is just a bad logo, right? So
yeah.
You don't necessarily need to adhere to that. I would just choose one blue out of that. And so I would say, which one do you like better? The more greeny blues or the slightly sort of richer sort of blue? Either's fine. So first thing I'd make a call on that, either this blue or this mid blue here. Once you've made that decision, and looking at it, I like the greeny blue, but actually if you look at this blue here, it's actually a really strong blue. So potentially you might want to play around with that one itself. And you'll see here, we're at saturation 100, so it's as bright as it's going to get. And so when you want to go darker, you obviously can't go down to 45 degrees then. You just go straight down your sort of square, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then for the light, you still sort of want to head off into a 45 degree sort of direction. You just don't want to get to the point where you're playing around. If you play around in this bottom left-hand corner, you're going to get a very desaturated, darky sort of color, and it's kind of like a gray. So you really want to play around with the top sort of triangle when you're playing around with that. So for me, I would make that decision which of the blue we'll play with. I would probably choose this bottom blue. I think it's a stronger color, and then you'd be able to play around with your colors there. You may want to get creative with how you spread that around. Knowing that this is probably going to be your darker color, I then make that my secondary color, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but your secondary color is your darker color of these ones, and that's what it's designed for. So I would choose that blue as my mid secondary, and it's even a little bit too light for that. So it's a little bit tricky. You could make it your primary mid, which would be fine, and play around that way. You would then want to have, if you did do that, choosing your primary would be, because you're going to have to go darker again than the blue, it's going to be a little bit tricky. So you probably want to stick with just a really darker blue, and you might want to, deviate the hue a little bit to get some light and shade there. So it's a little bit tricky when your primary color is kind of a darky color. So I think what you've done with choosing a yellow is probably the right call. I'm not sure how the client feels about yellow. Was that their call or your call?
That was their question. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, it's fine. So then your secondary mid is that color we picked straight off the logo. Deviating either side, just play around with that triangle like I spoke about. I probably would stick to the same hue there. As far as the yellows go, I would play around with the hue a little bit. I would tend up a little bit towards a tennis ball. You might even go in with your mid yellow as your tennis ball bright yellow. That might be a little bit controversial for them. I don't know how conservative they are. And then you can sort of tend towards a lemony yellow. And then on your darker one, you might go down to a more goldeny yellow color there. I can show you later on examples of, actually, I'll show you something here. Let me show you something I did a while ago. Let me just pull that up, 2 secs. So there you go, here's us. So if you have a look at, so have a look at this. Here's an example of some colours. Can you see how the tennis ball sort of yellow can sit nicely next to the sort of more goldeny yellow? That's just a slight hue saturation. You're not going to get that pop if you just stick to the same hue constantly. So that's why you do want to play around with it more in the primaries than in the secondaries. The secondaries, it's fine to sort of stick to the same hue and sort of just deviate light and dark. But your primaries, you have opportunities at least to be a little bit more playful with that. And you can sort of see how some of these yellows can actually sit really well next to each other, and still provide a little bit of pop from each other. So there's a little, there's a little interplay there with colours and how that sort of plays out, if that makes sense. So if you're going to get a yellow, I would even maybe choose something like that as your primary yellow, and then maybe go like something like that as your light primary, and then go a little bit darker again for your real dark sort of yellow. In fact, even you could almost get away with that being your primary dark, that color there. And I'm happy to share, if you like those colors, I'll share those values with you later on if you're interested. But that's my sort of process there. There's a bit of science, a little bit of art to it. But I guess the takeaways for me are, I wouldn't be wasting grey on any of those colours. I think that's your first thing. Your secondary should be the darker of the two colours. And your primaries, where you've got a little bit more playfulness, where you might want to screw around with some hue variations. Not much, probably not more than 20 degrees either way, like left, up and down from your midpoint. And you don't have to, but when you do it, you can get some nice more modern-y little color sort of variation. So there's that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Dan, do you have any questions?
No, I'm playing around with it at the moment on the JAir one as we speak, and it's working. It's fixing the problems
And also, I should have told you that the picture that is quite yellowy on the homepage has got an effect on it. So that's that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So whenever we're playing with duotones, this is why it should always be primary versus secondary. And because your primary is the dark, it's going to look like this. So at the moment, there's obviously, that's a white and a yellow. It's the wrong combo. So you just want to have your primary mid and your secondary mid playing around. I think your duotones can look really well together, but it can be overdone as well. So you really get that relationship between the secondary mid and the primary mid is really important, because that's going to make or break that duotone effect. So hopefully that's just that they can get sorted out. I'm not sure what's going on there. Anthony, I'm sure, was all over it.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I'm good. That was quite helpful. Very helpful, actually. Makes me want to go and play around with some stuff. So yeah, I don't think I've got any more questions. Oh, okay. So what, for example, Stuart, there's a station that's got really strong colors, red and black. They're the two colors of their logo. Would you choose one as the secondary, and then choose go to that color wheel, and then choose the opposite? So the blue chose yellow. Would you just choose red or black, and then go to the opposite spectrum for the second color?
Yeah, red's tricky. Look, if they are strongly monochromatic, and it's just like one color and it's tonal, and that's their identity and whatever, then injecting another color, just what I just said, is potentially, you'll get to the point where some people will rebel against that and not want to do that. And so you really just kind of just tonally have to play in your more neutrals will go as your secondary.
Yeah.
You would probably want to at least get a little bit cute with it and maybe get a little bit of a wash of color in here, a little bit. And you can see here this secondary dark. It almost looks black, right? But actually, when you see it next to it, it's actually a very distinct blue. So you can get away with getting a little wash of color if that ever happens. And when I'm playing with reds, when you get a light red, it can be really hard to get a light red. It just turns to pink, right? And then it can get really washed out real quick. And so with my reds, I do like playing around a little bit and go from a little bit violety. And so red is hue 0, right? So if you go, it's a circle. So then if you go like 360 down to like 350, you're going to go into more violety color. And if you go up, you're tending to more orange. And so a little bit of variation around a red can be really nice to get a violety or a burnt sort of orange color. You don't have to go both, but you probably don't want to go one variation. Going from a violety to an orange might be a bit too much, but you can play around with probably just having your mid is your red, getting a lighter a lighter pink. If you're struggling, a violety pink's going to look better than just a reddy pink. So that's how you can solve that problem. And then for your darker, you probably wouldn't want to go like it's almost a progression. So you probably want to pick a red here and then go to violet here and then go to violet this way. That's kind of like that'll sort of create a triangle. So you probably wanted to stick with your reds. You could play around with it. It's up to you. It's not fully rocket science. It's a lot of subjectivity. So play around with it. Just know when you're dealing with reds particularly, they can be really hard to make the lighter ones look good. So just remember you've got up your sleeve that hue. And if they're really monochromatic, I would be tempted to put at least a wash of color through there. And what that color should be, if it's a reddy, then yeah, sure, like a blue or a purple would work well with that. You probably would want to avoid greens, for example, when you're playing around with reds. You could at least go to that color wheel and at least, pick some sort of colors and sort of go around, play around that. There's lots of different models. It doesn't have to be complementary, but you do want to have a fair bit of contrast between the light and the dark. So in the example of the one we had where it's purpley and violet, it is more analogous, but our spread's kind of a little bit wider than this. So there's ways you can play around it. It's a really good tool, this. So have a look at it, color.com, and sort of play around with those sort of things. It's a really good starting point, and then you can just sort of hone in and get to that more subjective sort of side of things. And I'm sorry, I can't be more specific because it is a bit of a lot of my time I spend screwing with colours, and it can be really tough to get it right. But it's once you get it right, you'll know it, and it'll make it a big difference. It's starting to look better already.
Yeah.
But one of the big things is getting rid of the grey as one of your colours, because that was just washing a lot of stuff out. So already. Yeah, that's good. Like the good thing about blue and yellow is that they can both tend towards sort of green. Green's sort of in the midpoint. So when you are screwing with your hue, you might want to sort of bring the hues sort of together. So that to me has a really nice sort of green wash through the whole thing. And that's kind of nice, right? So that's definitely one way to go. And if you color picked from the J sort of gradient, that definitely had a green hue. That's definitely one of the ways you could have gone. And have seen that looks really nice. I like it.
Yeah, I'm happy with it. I think, so I just used the kind of gold color as the primary main or whatever, made it super dark for the dark, and then I took like a normal yellow and I made that light for the
I think blue's looking good. I'd still play around. I think your yellows are too desaturated still. I'm not sure if it's just the screen sharing, but it's still looking a little bit, so I'd still pump them up a little bit. I think your choices of blues are probably spot on, actually.
Yeah.
You may want to think about your secondary light might be a little bit lighter, maybe. But I think I would say, like, if we just you can see how those yellows, they look nice, and they look really nice together, but they are, when you see a color that's washed out, that means it's desaturated. And so it's probably a little bit too desaturated. So you might want to turn the saturation up a little bit on those ones. Even like the yellows that I haven't showed you, you could probably get away with that as your mid and your dark. I think your light's good.
So how would you turn the saturation up on this interface?
That's you don't. You got to go somewhere that has a hue saturation brightness model on it. Do you have Photoshop or anything like that?
Not on here at the moment.
I'd imagine there'll be probably even Adobe has it on that website, I'd imagine.
And that'll just come in, so then I can just grab the code from Photoshop and just stick it in there, can I? And that'll...
So you're always dealing with hexadecimal. How you get there, I would manipulate it using HSB. Sometimes it's called HSL. They change luminosity and brightness are interchangeable, but same concept. So yeah, you play around with that. I just think you got opportunity to make those yellows a little bit more punchy, but it looks 100 times better than what it did, a couple minutes ago. So that's good.
Great. Okay, cool. Thank you.
What actually works really well though, the screen effect, the blend over that photo actually sets a really nice tone. And you sort of see even there, like the blonde of her hair with that blue at the top of it actually matches well the yellows have actually chosen. It kind of works really well together. So depending on what sort of photos you have, that can work really good. And there's nothing wrong with it at all. I think it looks kind of really nice. You want to be careful about your white on yellows, and I guarantee you the primary, mid, and the white will fail, but it's not too bad. Like, this is an example where you think, I can get away with it. So have a little look at that. But you can sort of see there, if you scroll down to the bottom there again, I think your light, that's probably a little bit too much color there. So that's where I think you want to make that secondary light a little bit lighter, and that'll also mean the contrast on this mega menu is going to be higher as well, because those blues will stand out better over the top of the dark. So you probably want to tweak both. You probably want to tweak the blue to be a little bit lighter, and even the dark one just a touch darker.
The dark blue?
Yeah, that'll just get those contrast issues sorted out. And then I would be screwing around with the yellows as best you can. I think you're really close already. Like, that's really good. It's just a matter if you want a bit more vibrant or you want that. And when I say washed out, I don't mean that. That's not derogatory. That can be a real look you're after, right? So if that's what you want, then you got it. If you want something a little bit more poppy, then I would think about dialing up the yellows a little bit. But it's that's chilled, and that's maybe what they want, right?
Yeah.
I don't mind it.
It's hard to know, but I'll put it to them and kind of if they've got more feedback. But I'll dial up the yellows a bit.
I'd like to see how a duotone would work with those colours as well. It may be not a great combo with your more desaturated primary. But it means you might just never do duotone on this site. That should be fine.
Cool.
I think that's a really good job. Well done.
Cheers. Thank you.
Now, in here, and this if you go back to sharing again, Daniel, like if you do end up using that interface, you'll see there on here. So you've got that white circle there. So you've effectively, it's just a different way of dealing with what we've got. So your hue and your saturation is all handled by that sort of rectangle on the sort of side there, and your brightness is just straight up and down on that thing, and moving left to right is going to change your hue, which you don't want to do. Well, you do sometimes. So you can get it's the exact same concept, it's just a different levers you're pulling. So hue is left and right in this example, and up and down is brightness, and saturation is up and down on the right hand side. So same concepts, and in some ways it might be even easier to use this tool. So whatever works for you. I like the full hue, saturation, brightness, well, I find it easier to play around with, but it's the same concept.
Yep.